One of the richest countries on earth spent over $200 billion building a future the world could admire. Yet, in the same 15 years, it accepted fewer refugees than live on a single street in its own capital. How is that possible? Now compare that to a country that shares none of the language, none of the religion, and none of the history of the people arriving. At its border, Germany, in one single year, took in more Syrian refugees than the 6 Gulf monarchies combined have taken in across 7 decades. Read that again because it doesn't make sense on the surface, and it's not supposed to. A Syrian family fleeing bombs in Damascus will walk past the borders of some of the richest, most religiously aligned countries on the planet and keep walking for thousands of kilometers toward a country where nobody prays the way they pray and nobody speaks the way they speak. That is not an accident of geography. It's not generosity. It's not guilt. It is the output of 2 completely different rulebooks written in 2 completely different centuries. And once you see both rulebooks side by side, this entire mystery stops being a mystery and starts being math. This is EndGame analysis. Let's open both books. Let's put the real numbers on the table, because once you see them together, the scale of this gap becomes almost impossible to ignore. By the end of 2024, the European Union was sheltering close to 7.8 million registered refugees. Germany alone had absorbed more than 1.2 million people of Syrian origin since 2015. Sweden, a country with a total population smaller than the city of Cairo, took in nearly 200,000 Syrian-born residents in under 3 years. Now look east, to the countries that sit closest to the actual crisis. The UAE hosts fewer than 400 registered refugees. Qatar hosts under 200. Saudi Arabia doesn't formally recognize refugee status at all. A small number of families receive informal, revocable protection with no legal category attached to it. Put it side by side and the imbalance is almost cartoonish. A country of 10.6 million people, 4,000 kilometers away, with no shared language or faith, sheltered roughly 1,000 times more Syrian refugees than the entire combined oil-wealthy Gulf. Most people see that gap and reach immediately for a moral verdict. Europe is kind, the Gulf is cold. That verdict feels good. It's also almost completely beside the point. What you're actually staring at is not a difference in compassion. It's a difference in what each government's founding document was built to do. To understand it, we have to open Rulebook 1, the one written in the desert, centuries before oil. For most of history, the Arabian Peninsula was one of the least survivable places on the planet. Brutal heat, almost no rainfall, no large-scale farming. In that environment, the thing that kept you alive wasn't a government, it was your tribe, the network of blood relations who controlled the water, mediated disputes, and gave you the only safety net that existed. Get cut off from your tribe out there, and you weren't facing social isolation. You were facing death. That logic never disappeared. It got written directly into the modern Gulf state. Saudi Arabia isn't a geographic label. It translates literally to the Arabia of the House of Saud. The UAE is a federation of specific ruling families. Qatar is, structurally, the House of Al Thani. These aren't governments that happen to have royal families attached to them. The families built the state, the families own the state, and citizenship inside it works less like a legal status you can earn and more like membership in a family enterprise you're born into or you aren't. That's Rulebook 1. In a single sentence, belonging is a bloodline, not a border crossing. Keep that sentence in your head, because everything that follows, the labor system, the refugee policy, the entire relationship these countries have with outsiders, is just that sentence playing out at scale. Then oil turned these desert territories into some of the richest square kilometers on Earth, and wealth created a problem Rulebook 1 had never had to solve before. A modern economy needs millions of workers, and these countries had almost none of their own citizens to supply them. Saudi Arabia's citizen population is roughly 22 million, inside a country of 35 million total. In the UAE, citizens make up barely 1 in 10 residents. So the Gulf did the only thing its existing rulebook allowed. It imported labor by the millions from India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Egypt, and Sudan, on the same terms that it always applied to outsiders: useful, temporary, and never a candidate for belonging. The system built to manage this has a name: Kafala, sponsorship. Every foreign worker needed a local sponsor who controlled their visa, their ability to switch jobs, and in many cases whether they could leave the country at all. Human rights investigators documented passport confiscations, unpaid wages on a massive scale, and construction death tolls. That reporting has put in the thousands during the building boom before Qatar's 2022 World Cup. Reform has genuinely happened. Bahrain moved first in 2009, Qatar overhauled its system in 2019 and 2020, and in 2025, Saudi Arabia announced it was dismantling Kafala entirely under its Vision 2030 program, affecting an estimated 13 million workers. But here's the detail that exposes what the reform actually touched. A worker in Saudi Arabia today can switch employers and leave the country freely. That same worker still cannot become Saudi, not after 10 years, not after 30, not by marriage, not by birth. On Saudi soil, in the vast majority of cases, the reform fixed the paycheck. It left the bloodline untouched because the bloodline was never up for negotiation. Here's the part that finally explains the paradox, and it has nothing to do with religion. A construction worker from Kerala or a nurse from Manila arrives in the Gulf on a signed contract. Her loyalty runs to her paycheck and the family waiting on her remittances back home. She has no political stake in the country hosting her. She came for money, not because her own state collapsed underneath her. To the monarchy running the country, she is completely predictable, completely manageable. A refugee from Syria or Yemen is a different category of person entirely. The ruling families know it instantly. That person didn't sign a labor contract. Their state failed underneath them. Some watched their own government bomb their own neighborhoods. They carry political memory, sometimes political networks, sometimes direct experience organizing against a government that turned violent against its citizens. They weren't raised inside the Gulf's carefully managed patronage system, so they owe nothing to the local ruling family. In the cold language of a royal court managing its own survival, that person isn't a guest. They're an unpriced risk. The monarchies remember exactly why that risk terrifies them because they watched it happen in real time between 2010 and 2012. The Arab Spring toppled governments that had looked permanent for generations. Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, and nearly Bahrain, which Saudi troops had to cross a causeway to save. The lesson every ruling family filed away was blunt and permanent. Political order is not eternal, and the people most capable of ending it are exactly the people who have already lived through one government falling apart. There's an older warning too, one that almost never comes up in this debate. After 1948, Palestinian refugees moved into Jordan and Lebanon, initially welcomed under the banner of pan-Arab solidarity. Within a generation, in Jordan, the Palestine Liberation Organization had built something close to a rival authority inside the kingdom. And in 1970, that tension broke into open fighting, a conflict that ended with the PLO expelled by force. In Lebanon, the presence and later militarization of Palestinian refugee camps became one of several fault lines that helped pull the country into a 15-year civil war that killed an estimated 150,000 people. For a Gulf monarchy watching from a safe distance, that isn't ancient history. It's the entire argument in two case studies. Refugees do not stay passive forever and under the wrong conditions. They can become the political actors who bring down the government that let them in. Refusing to open the door isn't cruelty for its own sake. It's the same defensive calculation every ruling family on that peninsula has run since the well replaced by the tribe, now replaced by the barrel of oil. So if the Gulf was never going to take the wave, why couldn't Europe simply say no? Go back to 1945. Europe is rubble. Economies wrecked, cities flattened, and something even harder to rebuild than concrete. Political legitimacy, right after fascism, had just shown the world exactly what a modern state could do to its own people. Out of that specific catastrophe came a legal philosophy that had never operated at this scale before. Rights don't come from your passport. They come from being human. A state owes something to a person standing on its territory, foreigner or not, simply because they exist. That philosophy got written into binding law almost immediately. The European Convention on Human Rights in 1950, the Refugee Convention in 1951, and decades later the EU's shared asylum system. Alongside it, post-war Europe desperately needed labor to physically rebuild, so it imported workers on guest worker schemes explicitly designed to be temporary. Turks into Germany, Algerians into France, Pakistanis into Britain. They didn't leave. By pretending they would, and the legal architecture shifted permanently toward family reunification rights, renewable and eventually permanent residency, and birthright citizenship for children born on European soil. Every one of those legal layers made it progressively harder for a European government to refuse an asylum claim. Not politically impossible, but procedurally and legally much harder. So when Syria collapsed in 2011, when Afghanistan fell, when the Sahel destabilized, the people fleeing weren't choosing Europe out of romance. They were choosing the one region on Earth whose own law said, apply, and we are legally required to listen. Germany absorbed over 1 million people in 2015 alone, not because German public opinion demanded it in that moment, but because 70 years of legal architecture had already answered the question before the public was ever asked. This is Rulebook 2, and it's the exact mirror of Rulebook 1. Belonging isn't blood, it's presence. And once you're present, the machine is legally bound to eventually make room for you. The political backlash to Rulebook 2 has been real, and by 2025 it reached deep into the center of European politics. Hungary and Poland refused mandatory EU refugee quotas for years, citing national and cultural sovereignty, and absorbed fines and legal pressure rather than comply. Sweden? the country that built its entire national brand around humanitarian openness, now offers departing refugees roughly 350,000 kroner, about $31,000 to leave voluntarily, and run some of the tightest asylum rules in Western Europe, driven by gang violence tied to segregated neighborhoods and the political rise of parties campaigning explicitly against further immigration. In Germany, the coalition that took office in mid-2025 sharply tightened asylum policy. Applications fell by roughly half from peak years. France is fighting the same battle over its own suburbs, where a once fringe nationalist party is now a mainstream contender for power. But here's the line that gets lost in every single one of these political fights. Political mood swings hard in both directions on a 2 or 4 year cycle. Legal architecture doesn't move on that cycle at all. The convention is still signed. The directive is still binding. Every one of these governments can tighten the tap as hard as their voters demand. None of them can remove the pipe without dismantling the legal foundation their own state's legitimacy was rebuilt on in 1945. The water keeps moving, even while the people in charge of the tap are shouting that they want it stopped. Strip away the outrage on both sides, and you're left with something colder and far more useful. Two systems, each doing precisely what it was engineered to do, each paying a real price for it in a different currency. Rulebook 1 is built to extract labor while permanently protecting a bloodline model of citizenship. It's extremely effective at exactly that job. It has generated enormous promise, a capital wealth, and kept the same ruling families in power through oil booms, wars, and an Arab Spring that toppled several of their neighbors. The bill comes due in a ledger nobody prints in a tourism brochure. Millions of people who have lived and worked in these countries for decades who will never hold citizenship, never gain a vote, and in most cases will never pass citizenship to a child born on that soil. Rulebook 2 is built to absorb outsiders and eventually convert them into citizens. It is also extremely effective at exactly that job. Arguably, one of the most successful integration systems in modern history, at the scale it has actually operated at since the 1950s. The bill for that comes due differently. Political fracture, the fastest growing nationalist movements Europe has seen in a generation, and an open, unresolved argument in nearly every EU capital about whether the system can keep functioning at the speed the last 15 years have demanded of it. Neither rulebook is a morality play, and neither side here is the villain the internet wants them to be. A Saudi official isn't lying, awake plotting cruelty. He's running the same defensive calculation every ruling family on that peninsula has run since the tribe first replaced the well as the unit of survival. A German chancellor isn't a saint. She's reading, almost word for word, from a legal script her own country wrote for itself out of the rubble of 1945, and has never found a legitimate way to unwrite. So here's the honest answer to the question in the title. Muslims fleeing war aren't choosing Europe over the Gulf because Europe is warmer, kinder, or more welcoming in spirit. They're choosing Europe because Europe is the only place on the map where the rulebook was written to eventually let them stay, and the Gulf is the only place on the map where the rulebook was written on purpose to make sure they never could. 2 countries, 2 centuries of legal decisions, one number that shouldn't add up until you realize it was never supposed to. Be about kindness in the first place. It was always about which book got signed and which book got left closed. That's the real answer behind the number that opened this video. And it's not the answer either side of this argument wants to hear, which is exactly why nobody talks about it this way.